The night was unusually quiet, the sky cloaked in thick clouds that blotted out the stars. A pale sliver of moonlight occasionally slipped through, casting fleeting reflections across the slow-moving river. Along its bank, a man emerged from the shadowy tree line, cradling something close to his chest. His finely tailored coat and polished shoes seemed out of place in the muddy, overgrown grass, but he didn't hesitate as he made his way toward a small wooden rowboat tethered to a crooked stake in the mud. He looked around nervously, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, any curious eyes. But the woods were silent, as if holding their breath. The bundle in his arms stirred gently, making the faintest cooing sound. The man froze. His jaw clenched. Then slowly, he lowered his eyes to the swaddled twin babies in his arms, two fragile newborns, asleep, unaware of the fate that had been decided for them. One had a small tuft of dark hair, the other wore a tiny knitted cap that barely fit its round head. Their cheeks were flushed with life, their hands curled into tiny fists. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in the man's eyes, guilt, maybe sorrow, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. With a mechanical coldness, he stepped into the boat, placing each baby carefully in a makeshift cradle of blankets laid on the floorboards. He untied the rope. The boat creaked as it rocked slightly. The man gave it one last shove into the river. It drifted slowly into the current, carried away from the bank, from safety, from the world that might have loved them. The man stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, as if trying to convince himself this was necessary. Then, with a final glance at the disappearing shape on the water, he turned and walked away into the darkness, never noticing the glint of watching eyes among the trees. From behind a thick veil of branches, partially concealed by the shadows of the forest, the eyes of a silent witness glimmered. It was a horse, tall, strong, and still as stone, standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The creature had been grazing peacefully earlier that evening, tethered loosely by its reins near a grove familiar to its owner. But when the man had emerged from the house and made his way toward the river with something bundled in his arms, the horse had lifted its head, ears pricking forward. Now, it stood frozen, alert, watching. The horse's breathing was soft but steady, the rise and fall of its chest barely visible. Its dark, intelligent eyes followed the man's every move with uncanny focus. It could sense something was wrong, animals always could. Perhaps it was the way the man moved with no gentleness, no warmth. Perhaps it was the eerie quiet of the forest that seemed to listen in with the same tension. Or maybe it was the sharp, unmistakable instinct of a creature that lived closer to nature's truths than humans ever did. When the man stepped into the boat and lowered the two small forms inside, the horse shifted slightly, hooves crunching faintly on the underbrush. Still, it didn't make a sound. It simply stared, absorbing the scene in front of it with a stillness that somehow seemed almost human. When the boat began to drift, the horse's nostrils flared, and it took a step forward, muscles tensing. Its gaze moved from the man, who was now retreating into the woods, back to the boat gently being carried away by the current. Something stirred deep inside the animal, not fear, but urgency. It let out a quiet snort, almost like a whisper, and pawed the ground lightly. The wind shifted. The river whispered louder. The trees stood tall and silent. Only the horse bore witness to the cruelty that had just unfolded. And though it could not speak, though it could not scream or accuse, it would remember. It would not forget. It had seen everything. And soon, it would act. The small wooden boat drifted gently down the river, carried by the slow but steady current. The night air was cool and heavy, filled with the distant chorus of crickets and the soft rustling of leaves brushing against one another in the breeze. The twins, barely days old, lay nestled side by side in the center of the boat, wrapped in thin blankets that offered little warmth. One of them stirred first, his tiny lips parted, a faint whimper escaping into the night. His sister remained still, her chest rising and falling in soft, shallow breaths. The river, though calm, had a quiet power in its movements. The boat rocked slightly as it passed over ripples, occasionally bumping gently against low-hanging branches or floating debris. It was a cradle of danger disguised in stillness. Overhead, the moon began to peek out from behind the clouds, casting a pale glow on the water's surface. It illuminated the infants' faces for a moment, so innocent, so vulnerable, so unaware of the peril surrounding them. A sharp cry pierced the silence. The boy had awakened fully now, his hunger and fear manifesting in a trembling wail. The sound echoed across the water, startling an owl perched nearby. The bird took off with a beat of its wings, but no other response came. There were no arms to lift the baby, no voice to soothe him, no warmth to offer comfort. The girl twitched in her sleep, disturbed by the sound, her face scrunching up before she began to cry as well. Together, their cries floated through the trees, a desperate harmony of helplessness and abandonment. The river paid no mind. It continued to carry them forward, deeper into the unknown. The canopy above thickened, casting longer shadows across the water. Occasionally, the boat would spin slightly in the current, turning the twins' faces away from the moonlight and into the dark. Wildlife watched from a distance, foxes in the underbrush, a deer drinking cautiously downstream. But none approached. The forest, so alive and alert, seemed to observe silently, waiting for something, anything, to intervene. And yet, in the midst of all this quiet dread, there was still a strange beauty to the scene. The glimmer of starlight reflected on the water, the soft whisper of leaves, the rhythm of the river's flow. But that beauty only made the situation feel more tragic, as if nature itself mourned what had been done. The babies cried on, and the boat continued its silent journey through the dark. Deep in the woods, long after the man had vanished and the boat had disappeared downstream, the white horse remained still for a moment longer, as if processing what it had just witnessed. Then, with sudden urgency, it snorted loudly and reared slightly, its hooves striking the forest floor. It had no voice to scream the horror it had seen, but its instincts surged to life, and they drove it into motion. The reins that loosely tied it to a slender birch snapped free with a forceful tug of its neck, and in an instant the horse broke into a run. The creature darted through the underbrush with powerful strides, leaping over fallen logs and weaving between trees with a speed born of desperation. Leaves scattered in its wake. Birds burst from branches as the thunder of hooves echoed through the forest. The horse wasn't just running wildly, it had a destination. Something deep within it knew where to go. Not to the man's estate, not to the river again, but to a little cottage tucked between two hills on the edge of the woods. There, lived someone who always listened, someone who had fed it when it was hurt, someone who would understand. The old widow was just finishing her nightly tea when she heard the frantic pounding outside. At first, she thought it was a storm, but when she stepped onto her porch, her eyes widened. The white horse stood there, heaving, its flanks slick with sweat, eyes wide with panic. It had no saddle, no rider, and its reins hung broken around its neck. The widow, wise in years and weathered by life, didn't ask questions. She had always believed animals knew more than humans gave them credit for. She approached the horse slowly, placing a gentle hand on its trembling side. "What is it, girl?" she whispered, more to herself than the beast. The horse let out a loud, sharp whinny, then turned and started pacing toward the woods, looking back anxiously every few steps. The woman grabbed her shawl and a lantern, her heart beating fast. She'd seen that kind of fear in an animal only once before, during the flood that nearly swept her home away. Without hesitation, she followed. The horse led her down forgotten trails, across a dried creek bed, and through a patch of thorny undergrowth. The trees thickened, and the forest seemed darker, heavier. Still, the animal pressed on. Somewhere along the path, the widow's knees ached, and her breath grew short, but the horse never slowed. It trotted ahead with purpose, driven by a sense no human could fully grasp. The widow didn't know what she was about to find, only that something was terribly wrong, and this horse, this beautiful creature who had never lied with its eyes, was her only guide into the unknown. The forest opened slightly as the horse broke through a patch of dense brush, its coat glistening with sweat and moonlight. The old widow followed as quickly as her legs would allow, lifting her skirt to avoid the brambles that tugged at its hem. Her lantern swung in her hand, casting long, flickering shadows across the gnarled roots and damp earth. The horse stopped at the edge of a slope, nostrils flaring, ears perked forward, staring down toward the riverbank below. The widow stepped beside it, steadying herself against a tree as she peered into the darkness. For a moment, she saw nothing. The river shimmered in the faint moonlight, winding like a silver snake through the landscape. Then, movement. A dark shape drifting downstream, too small to be a boat for fishing, too large to be a bundle of debris. Her heart caught in her throat. She brought the lantern higher, squinting. The flame flickered, barely illuminating what looked like a low wooden vessel. As it drifted closer, her breath caught. Inside, she could just make out two tiny forms wrapped in fabric, lying side by side. "Dear God," she gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. The horse whinnied beside her, stamping a hoof in urgency. Without thinking, the widow turned and began scrambling down the slope, half slipping into loose soil, grasping at branches to steady herself. The terrain was steep and unforgiving, but adrenaline gave her strength. Every second felt like a lifetime as the boat drew nearer to the river's bend, where the current quickened and thick reeds choked the water's edge. When she finally reached the riverbank, she looked upstream. The boat was only 20 or 30 feet away now, drifting lazily, though the babies inside had started to fuss. One of them cried out, a thin, reedy wail that pierced the silence and sliced through her heart. The widow stepped into the cold water, barely flinching as it soaked through her shoes and skirts. She waded forward, lantern high in one hand, her other arm outstretched, calling softly, "Hold on, little ones. I'm coming." The current tugged at her legs, but she pushed forward, teeth clenched, water rising to her waist. The boat floated closer. One of the twins shifted, their tiny hand flailing against the air. Closer. She could see their faces now, red, scrunched with discomfort, but alive. Just a few more feet. With a final surge of effort, the widow lunged through the water, grabbing the side of the boat and pulling it toward her. It rocked slightly but stayed upright. She steadied it, then reached in, gently lifting one baby into her arms, then the other. Both were crying now, weak but steady. Tears blurred her vision as she cradled them against her chest, whispering soothing words she hadn't spoken in years. Behind her, on the shore, the horse neighed again, loud and triumphant, as if it knew the rescue had succeeded. The widow turned back toward land, babies held tightly against her, heart pounding with relief. She didn't know who had sent these children into the river or why, but one thing was certain: fate, or something greater, had chosen not to let them die that night. And it had sent a horse to bear witness. The night was still heavy with mist as the old widow stood at the edge of the riverbank, drenched and trembling, both from the cold water that clung to her clothes and the overwhelming surge of emotion pulsing through her chest. The two infants, now bundled tightly in her shawl, whimpered softly against her warmth, their tiny hands gripping at the cloth instinctively. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, but her mind had already shifted to what came next. The river had almost taken them. She couldn't let it try again. She looked up at the horse, who stood just a few paces up the slope. Its body alert and tense, as if awaiting her next move. The creature's eyes reflected the moonlight and something more, a kind of determination, loyalty beyond understanding. She nodded to it, as if thanking an old friend, and then began to trudge up the incline with the babies in her arms, slipping occasionally on the wet ground but refusing to falter. Her boots squelched with water, her back ached, but none of it mattered now. Every step she took was powered by something deeper than strength, a silent vow that she would not let these children be lost again. As they reached the top of the hill, the horse moved beside her, lowering its head to sniff the infants gently. The widow allowed it for a moment, her lips trembling at the sight. "You knew," she murmured to the horse. "You saw everything, didn't you?" The animal huffed softly, a warm breath misting in the cool night air. The journey back to her cottage was slow and careful. The path was narrow and twisted through tangled trees, but the horse took the lead, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was still following. The widow wrapped the children as best she could, pressing their bodies close to hers, murmuring comforting words under her breath. One of them had calmed, sucking quietly on a thumb, while the other made small hiccuping sobs in its sleep. The forest, so ominous earlier, now seemed to part before them. The trees no longer loomed with menace, and even the wind felt warmer, less biting. It was as though nature itself understood the urgency of their mission. By the time the widow's lantern light flickered against the weathered wood of her cottage, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. She pushed open the door with her shoulder and entered the warm, dim room, smelling faintly of herbs, wood smoke, and old books. She rushed to the hearth, laying the babies gently on a thick wool blanket before stoking the fire back to life. The horse remained outside, pacing the porch like a sentry on duty. As the fire grew, the room filled with light and warmth. She examined the babies one by one, checking their fingers, their faces, listening to their breathing. They were small, underfed, but resilient. Fighters. Survivors. She wrapped them again and nestled them in a wicker cradle she had once used decades ago. It creaked softly as she rocked it, her eyes never leaving their faces. And though the night had been filled with danger, the widow knew it wasn't over. Whoever left these children had wanted them gone for good. That kind of cruelty didn't disappear without consequence. But for now, they were safe. They had been saved from the river. Saved by a woman who had once thought her days of caring for others were over. Saved by a horse that had seen what no human had. Saved by something greater than either of them could explain. Morning broke slowly over the village, casting golden light through the mist that still hovered above the rooftops and fields. Birds began to stir, and distant roosters called out to the dawn. But the usual peace of the new day was different, charged with a quiet tension that rolled across the valley like a wave. Word had begun to spread. It started with a farm boy who saw the white horse return from the woods, covered in sweat and dirt, its reins dragging behind it. Then it was the local baker who noticed the old widow moving through her garden at first light, holding not herbs or firewood but two tiny infants wrapped in blankets. By mid-morning, the whispers had become a storm of curiosity and concern. People gathered in small knots along the village road, murmuring and pointing toward the cottage. Some didn't believe it. Others remembered the wealthy man, the recluse who lived in the grand estate on the hill, the one who rarely spoke but was known to have lost his wife in childbirth months before. He had told no one about the children. No one had seen them. And now, suddenly, two infants had floated down the river like a tragic secret finally coming to the surface. The old widow remained calm, moving with quiet resolve. She had sent a message to the town magistrate through the blacksmith's boy and now sat near the hearth, feeding one of the babies with a makeshift bottle. The other slept soundly in the cradle. Her face was stern, but her hands were gentle. The horse, meanwhile, stood outside the cottage like a guardian, hooves planted firmly, eyes watchful. It wasn't long before the magistrate arrived, flanked by two officers. Behind them came a crowd of curious villagers, some clutching shawls to their chests, others exchanging concerned glances. The magistrate knocked once, firmly, and the widow opened the door without hesitation. Inside, the officers examined the children carefully. The magistrate listened as the widow recounted everything, how the horse had come to her door in a panic, how it had led her to the river, how she had waded into the cold water and pulled the babies from the drifting boat. Her voice never shook. She spoke not with drama, but with truth. Then, she did something no one expected. She reached for a ribbon tied around one infant's wrist. From beneath the cloth, she pulled out a tiny gold medallion engraved with a crest, the family seal of the wealthy man on the hill. Gasps rose from the crowd. There was no denying it now. These were his children. As the murmurs grew louder, the magistrate grew grim. He had known the man for years, but this was unthinkable. He ordered the man summoned at once. Within the hour, the wealthy father stood in the widow's cottage, his face pale, lips pressed in a tight line. He denied everything at first, said the babies were not his, that he had no knowledge of any boat. But when he saw the medallion, his eyes betrayed him. When the horse stepped forward and nudged one of the infants protectively, his expression cracked. The room was silent. The widow stared him down. They were meant to die, she said coldly. But they didn't. And now, the truth will not stay buried. The magistrate ordered his arrest on the spot. The villagers, once uncertain, now stood firm in silent judgment. The man who had lived above them all, hiding his shame and cruelty behind walls of wealth, was now exposed, because of a horse that refused to ignore what it saw, and a woman who refused to walk away. Justice, finally, had begun. The wealthy man was taken away in silence, his hands bound, his head lowered, no longer cloaked in power or pride. The villagers watched as the magistrate's men led him down the cobbled road, their faces a mixture of shock, sadness, and quiet satisfaction. The tale of what he had done, the abandonment of his own newborn children, the secret he tried to cast into the river's cold current, had already taken root in the hearts of everyone who heard it. And in the center of the story stood not just the crime, but the miracle, the old widow, the white horse, and the tiny twins who had defied death itself. In the days that followed, the village changed. People came from neighboring towns to hear the story firsthand. Mothers wept at the thought of the river carrying babies to their doom. Fathers held their children closer at night. The widow's cottage became a place of quiet reverence. Strangers left blankets, milk, and little wooden toys at her gate. But she asked for nothing. Her only concern was the children now sleeping soundly in her home, their cheeks fuller each day, their cries louder and healthier with every passing hour. The horse remained ever close. It grazed outside the cottage, paced when the babies cried, and stood guard through the night like a loyal sentinel. No reins tied it. No commands guided it. It had chosen its place beside them. When villagers approached, the horse would step between them and the door, protective but calm. It had witnessed cruelty, and it would allow no harm to come near again. One morning, as the sun rose in pinks and golds, the widow stood in the doorway holding one of the twins while the other lay swaddled in a cradle at her feet. She gazed across the fields toward the hills beyond, where once the wealthy man had ruled over his estate like a king. That grand house now stood empty, cold, and lifeless, its gates sealed, its windows dark. The estate had been seized by the magistrate, and the courts would soon decide its future. Some said it should be turned into an orphanage or a hospital. Others believed it should be torn down entirely. But the widow paid it no mind. Her world was no longer concerned with wealth or punishment. Her purpose had shifted entirely. She named the babies Miriam and Elias. Names from her childhood, from a time when life had been simple and full of dreams. Every day, she sang to them by the fire, fed them with loving care, and rocked them gently in the same cradle that had once held her own child many years ago, long since past. The twins became the heartbeat of her little home, and with them, came new breath to a life she had thought was nearing its end. The villagers slowly stopped calling her the widow, and instead began to call her grandmother, even those not related to her. Children brought her flowers. Farmers helped chop her firewood. The blacksmith mended her roof without charge. In saving the twins, she had rekindled something in all of them, a reminder of kindness, of courage, of standing up when no one else will. As for the horse, it never left. It would be seen walking alongside the cradle as if counting every breath, as if guarding their dreams. Some claimed it was no ordinary animal, that it had been sent by fate, or even the spirit of the widow's late husband. Others simply said it was the purest example of loyalty the village had ever known. Years later, when the twins were old enough to run through the fields with bare feet and laughter in their voices, they would often climb onto the horse's back, giggling as it trotted through the meadow. They didn't remember the night of the river, the cold, or the cries, but the widow did. Every time she saw them play, her eyes would fill with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Against all odds, they had survived. Not because of chance, but because a horse had remembered, and a woman had listened. And so, the story became legend, passed down from one generation to the next, not of a man's cruelty, but of a creature's silent bravery, and a heart that refused to stop caring.